Hello and welcome back. This is the week 9 lecture. So today we're talking about the new Hollywood, and our film for the week is Bullitt, starring Steve McQueen. So I'll get into all of that momentarily, but I just wanted to start, mostly so I don't forget, I wanted to start with a brief mention of our upcoming essay assignment. So hopefully you guys read my instructions and my little sort of announcement about the assignment last week. So by now, this is early in week 9. You guys, hopefully, by this point, have completed the rough draft, submitted it to me, and I'm going to try to get you feedback within a few days of receiving those drafts, so you guys have time to make the necessary revisions and edits so you can submit the final drafts at the end of this week. So that is our goal. That's what we are striving for. I really encourage you guys, if you have any questions, if you want to talk more about your paper, if you have some ideas that you want to sort of toss around, if you're just unsure about something, don't hesitate to get in touch with me, email me. We can always set up a video conference. We can just exchange emails as well if that's easier. But if you have questions or concerns, get in touch with me. We have this entire week to continue to work on the papers. So in light of that, in light of the fact that I really want everybody to be focused on those midterm essays, that's the name of the assignment. It's not a midterm exam, it's just an essay that's due at the midway point of the semester. Because I want everyone focused on those, I'm actually going to give you a break and cut the discussion post for this week. But I still want you guys to watch the film. We're going to have a chance to talk about it next week along with the film that we're watching then. So I do want you guys to eventually discuss Bullitt, but we can wait a little bit on that and make sure that we have the papers finished first. So I've also cut back on your reading a little bit for this week. So originally we had 2 chapters scheduled for week 9, but I really just want you guys to read the chapter on the new Hollywood, which starts on page 475, I believe. That's really all we need to read. The other chapter's all about Hollywood and television, but we sort of covered a lot of those highlights last week. We actually read a little bit about the relationship between those two mediums, and I gave you a little bit of info about the way that TV sort of influenced movies, and also how movies initially were very sort of wary or sort of hostile towards TV because they viewed it as competition, but then later they started to work out sort of syndication deals, licensing deals. They sold some of their film libraries to the TV, networks, so that movies could start to be aired on television. So we talked about some of that stuff last week. So, I don't think we need to really go back through that entire chapter. I just wanted to hit a few final highlights about TV, and then we'll get into the new Hollywood, which leads us into Bullitt near the end of the lecture. So like I said, we've already kind of talked about the relationship between Hollywood and TV. We mostly, did enough of that last week. But one thing to just sort of reiterate, I think I sort of talked about this in last week's lecture, but I want to repeat it and just make it really clear. Something that happens, a big change in Hollywood, and we talked about it last week, was these various antitrust measures that the government took against the major studios, basically weakening the studios, deciding that they had too much power, they had monopolized their, areas, and the government basically took away that vertical integration that we talked about earlier in the semester, the way the studios were able to control production, distribution, and exhibition. For the most part, studios lost that exhibition arm. They no longer owned the theaters. They could no longer bully the theaters through block booking and sort of force theater owners to buy whatever movies the studio wanted them to buy. So those practices went away, like by the end of the 50s, really into the 60s. So there were a lot of changes that came about because of that. But one of the big things that happened, as they point out in the chapter, is that it forced movies to start, like the movie industry, to start being a little bit more willing to work with television. because that was a way to kind of replace the revenue that they were losing as a result of losing control of exhibition. So increasingly, the Hollywood studios get involved in television production. They get involved on the production side. They also get involved on the distribution side. And another really interesting thing that happens over the course of the 60s and into the 70s, and they mention this in the chapter as well, is increasingly, and this ties into the New Hollywood, increasingly a lot of movies were shooting on location. So they weren't using the old classic Hollywood sound stages and sets and all of that stuff on the actual studio lots that had been used a lot in filming back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, into the 50s, when most movies were shot on manufactured stages. But one thing we're going to hear about this week with the New Hollywood is, this younger generation of directors that comes of age and starts making movies in the 60s and 70s. They largely reject a lot of that sort of studio or soundstage set design sort of shooting. They want to get out and do on-location shooting with more lightweight cameras, more movement, more realism, sort of a more naturalistic feel. That's a characteristic of films that come out during the New Hollywood period, and that includes Bullitt. So we can certainly see examples in Bullitt, which was filmed almost entirely on location in San Francisco. And you can really tell, if you've ever been to the city, or even if you've just seen it represented, you can sort of tell that they really are there. You can't necessarily create that on a set or on a soundstage. So as more and more movies are getting shot on location, more and more TV shows start to get shot on these studio lots, on the sets and sound stages that had previously been used for movie production. Now by the 70s, late 60s into the 70s, that stuff was being used increasingly for TV production. And studios were involved in TV production and also selling the TV shows to various different exhibitors and carriers. So they get in on the TV business, is kind of the way to put this. Remember, the studios have been weakened. They have lost some of their power as a result of many factors that we covered last week. Not only the antitrust sort of pursuit by the government, but also the rise of television, the fact that, society was sort of changing. A lot of people were leaving cities, moving to the suburbs. So those old movie palaces went away. For a while, movie attendance declined. But we also mentioned last week that as people are moving to the suburbs, you're also getting these new multiplexes, these new kinds of movie theaters with a lot of different screens. They might not have been sort of palatial and beautiful like those old classical Hollywood movie palaces, but they can pack in a lot of people, they can show a lot of movies, and they spring up largely in shopping malls throughout a lot of suburban communities in America. So eventually movie attendance kind of picks up again, and as we're going to see, there's a lot of new technology that also really starts working in the studio's benefit. So even though they lose that vertical integration, they are still largely in control. They get involved with TV. They get involved later with the whole VHS market, the whole idea of video cassettes, watching movies, at home. That's pretty novel. So the studios continue to exercise a lot of power, and they're still very heavily involved in, getting their movies distributed internationally, exporting Hollywood films to the rest of the world, like we've been talking about before. But just a final thing to mention about TV before we move on for good, something else that happens in the 70s. By then, most film studios had sold their libraries. They had sold the rights to show their movies to the studios. We talked about how that process began kind of in the late 40s with RKO and Howard Hughes. But within a couple of decades, everybody had done it. And some of the legal, sticky, sort of thorny issues with residuals and, paying actors and stuff, that had been cleared up. So it was easier to show Hollywood movies on TV. It wouldn't be first run, right? They're still in theaters for their first run. But then once they're done playing in theaters, they can play on TV, of course, with commercials. That's a way people can watch them. So, of course, eventually Hollywood embraces that because that's just a way, again, to increase viewership. But they mention, a lot of old-timey Hollywood things start to go away in the 60s and 70s. This is, in many ways, kind of a period of modernization. And a lot of aspects of sort of modern movie going that we might be more familiar with really come into, sort of rise to prominence during this time. So we mentioned last week the rating system. We didn't have a comprehensive, consistent rating system for movies until the 60s. That surprises a lot of people, but it took us a long time. It took us longer than most other countries. Most other countries with robust film industries already had rating systems. We did not. We, for a long time, had a pretty strict sort of censorship policy and a sort of like moral code that would be applied really to all movies. So for a long time, there were just many, many things that you couldn't show on screen. Obviously, you couldn't show a lot of, sexuality. You couldn't show certain types of violence. You really couldn't show blood or gore. You couldn't show even sort of moderate amounts of like partial nudity. Obviously, language was very heavily enforced. So something that happens in the 60s is, you have a rating system. So producers and studio executives can be a lot more targeted as far as their audience. So this has kind of an interesting effect because in some ways having a rating system provides more freedom, because if it's established up front that this particular film that's getting made, by a studio is going to be a rated R movie, then the director and the other creatives involved with the film have a certain degree of sort of freedom and license. They can show maybe a sex scene. They can show more graphic depictions of violence if that's what they want to do. If maybe it's a horror movie or something. They can have bad language if they want to capture the way people really speak, right? Because it's going to be labeled as a rated R film, so people under the age of 17 aren't really supposed to watch it, at least not, unsupervised. But it gives you these clear parameters. Okay, we're doing a PG-13 movie, so we can get away with some things, but not others, right? And we all kind of know how those rating systems work, how the different ratings work, because we still have them. Today. Although it is getting a little bit murky because a lot of streaming stuff isn't necessarily rated. Increasingly, stuff that's not playing in theaters will not always get a rating designation, which can cause some confusion or raise questions, for parents. Is this appropriate for my kid or whatever? I remember in my family, it was always a battle. My parents wouldn't let me watch certain movies, and of course, those were the movies that I wanted to watch the most, and it was usually based on the rating. Yeah, well, it's rated R, so, you can't watch it. So that's happening, but also some old features that we've talked about, like B movies, kind of go away. Those really cheap productions that most of the major studios financed back in the sort of golden age of Hollywood, they go away. They're largely replaced by TV. Now, if you want to do cheaper productions, you can do a TV movie. Or you can do a mini-series, or you could even, help, finance the production or distribution of a particular show. So things are starting to change. Those old newsreels that would often play before the featured attraction in theaters, they largely go away. Because by the 60s and 70s, most people have access to television. And if you have that, you can watch the news on TV. You can watch the evening news, which few people do today, but a lot of people did back then. So with the evening news, and newspapers and all these other, radio, all these other ways to get your news, you don't really need the newsreel at the movie theater. So those were largely replaced by previews, coming attractions, sneak peeks at other films that would be coming out soon. And of course, those are standard now most of the time when we go to the movies. Also, certain genres kind of go away. So I mentioned the B movies, these like cheap, often genre films like, gangster movies or, sort of cheap horror movies. A lot of those kind of stopped getting made for a while, or at least not as many. And also, part of that also was like, they mentioned in the book, like certain kinds of films that maybe in previous eras would have been labeled as like, a woman's picture, like certain kinds of melodrama. Again, these would often be like low budget productions that would be sort of marketed for a specific audience, and they'd be filmed on, the studio's backlot, cheap, quick production. It wouldn't make a ton of money, but it could play in some theaters, and you'd have a certain audience that would, pay to go and see it. But again, a lot of those types of cheapy genre movies sort of fell out of favor, at least for a while, because TV seemed like a better alternative. You could put that kind of stuff on TV instead. But as we'll see, there's kind of a revitalization of the classic Hollywood genre movies. That kind of comes a little bit later, but it serves as a pretty big development in its own right. But another big thing that happens really in the 70s, and they talk about this quite a bit in the chapter, is the development of the Hollywood blockbuster. A concept that I think we are all very familiar with now. These big budget movies that are often targeted towards a very large audience, a wide cross section of people. These are often adventure or action movies. I think in more recent years, we've probably seen a lot of them end up being sort of like superhero movies, but they're sort of mass marketed. They're very expensive to make. They might have expensive visual effects, very large casts, pretty prestigious in terms of like who's in the films, who's directing the film, writers, cinematographers, again, really high production cost, and they usually make a ton of money. So the book mentions Jaws in 1975 as kind of the first quintessential blockbuster, at least the way we use that term today. So that's starting to happen too, and that really changes movie going in some ways. Studios start to focus more of their energy on creating blockbusters that will be enormously profitable to a wide cross-section of people, and other types of productions might sort of get neglected, or like we say, kind of get phased out as a result of that. So all of that's starting to happen really once we move into the 70s. But if we're talking about the new Hollywood, and I sort of want to get into this a little bit, the book actually defines the term in a way that I don't fully agree with. I mean, we can talk about how the book describes it, but they're offering a very narrow sort of idea of what the new Hollywood was. Typically, film historians and scholars will expand it a little bit and refer to this really as a movement that begins maybe in the mid or late 1960s and extends really up until the early 1980s. And it's hard to classify these movies all together because they're very different in terms of subject matter, style, all of those things. They're not really united in any of those ways. They're just united in the fact that they were largely made by this sort of younger generation of filmmakers who were sort of experimenting a little bit with narrative form, and they were also using a lot of classical Hollywood genres. But in the fashion of many innovators, they were sort of taking something older and reimagining it, sort of thinking about new ways to use those genres, ways to maybe have fun with them, but also ways to sort of unlock new potential in those genres. So it's kind of this interesting combination of, these guys were both sort of reaching back to Hollywood's past while also embracing new techniques, a lot of new technical aspects, and sort of creating exciting new types of films. And also they were a little bit liberated. I mean, some of this has to do with sort of socio-cultural context, like what's going on in America, during the 60s and 70s. There's sort of a counterculture, sort of a big youth-led movement that's sort of rejecting a lot of old standards and sort of rules, and the movies really were not an exception to that. You have these young filmmakers who are doing things differently, kind of challenging certain long accepted ideas, but also sort of paying their reverence, also sort of paying homage to classic Hollywood, which they grew up with, and using a lot of those old genres and some of those old techniques, but again, combining them with new things. And like we were talking about weeks ago, many of these directors sort of embraced the auteur theory, which came from French filmmakers, the French New Wave, and particularly French critics and film scholars who really came up with this idea and largely used it to refer to older American directors from the classical Hollywood era. But basically the idea is the director as an artist. The director not as just a contract player who works for a studio and basically does what he's told to make the movie on time, on budget, and make it appeal to a lot of people, but rather an artist who is collaborating with other artists like the screenwriter, the director of photography or cinematographer, sound guy, costumes, art director, all of those other people. But the director in this vision is an artist too, and they're expressing their own original sort of artistic vision. So sort of maybe presenting their own views or drawing from their own experiences. Something that the directors in classic Hollywood probably wouldn't have done very much. That wasn't really part of the job. So kind of changing the idea of the director from sort of a skilled craftsman or a skilled technician and thinking about it more like an artist on par with an author or a painter or a sculptor or somebody else in a different, artistic form. So a lot of these guys sort of embraced that idea. They were very influenced by the French New Wave and also by other European art film. So that's often how scholars sort of describe it. It's like these guys grew up on classic Hollywood, because you got to remember, if they're like young adults in the 60s and 70s, they had probably been growing up in the 40s, 50s, still kind of seeing that golden age. So they were products of that golden age of Hollywood, but then they often would go to film school or study film later in life and watch European art films, like from places like France, Germany, Italy. We touched on some of those traditions a couple of weeks ago, and they were influenced by some of these new innovative techniques. Also, not just with technical stuff, also new ways to tell stories. Not always featuring heroes, not always featuring conclusions or resolutions that are really tidy and neat and happy endings. So they were experimenting with some of that stuff, but they were using a lot of the classic genres of Hollywood, like sort of old sort of adventure serials, or like the stuff that you might have seen on a Saturday afternoon, sort of B movies, low budget sort of adventure action type movies were hugely influential to Steven Spielberg, also George Lucas, who drew on a lot of that stuff when he did Star Wars. So they're influenced by a lot of these older genres, but again, how do we do newer things with them? But also, I mentioned earlier that a lot of these directors wanted a more realistic, naturalistic sort of feel. They didn't want to shoot everything inside on a set or a soundstage. So this kind of taste for realism, naturalism, they often wanted to get outside. They wanted to shoot on location. They wanted to use smaller cameras. They wanted more movement, more mobility. Again, that was sort of this new way of sort of treating reality. And they found that audiences, particularly young people, kind of responded more to that style of filmmaking in the 60s and 70s. They were sort of rejecting a lot of the older Hollywood styles, like stylish musicals or big cinematic epics, the kind of stuff that we've seen. Some of those more traditional older genres, or in some ways more styles than necessarily genres, like the Marx Brothers, or the kind of epic that we saw with the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Increasingly, audiences viewed those kind of movies as very contrived, like very artificial, clearly not real, clearly sort of inauthentic. And I think audiences have always had some room and some patience for movies that are fantastical and aren't trying to be realistic. But during this time, and again, there's lots of sort of political, historical factors for this, Vietnam, Watergate, the counterculture, but for various reasons, you have audiences that really want more authenticity. They want a greater sense of realism than maybe previous movies or previous eras of cinema had been giving them. So this style, and we very much see it in Bullitt, this real effort to create realism, it really gets heightened during this era. Also, we're seeing different techniques when it comes to editing. I kind of mentioned this last week. For a long time, in the classical Hollywood model, editing was done really just in one way. It was done to create the illusion of continuity, right? It was done to create the illusion of continuous action without cuts, trying to sort of make the cuts almost seem invisible, the cuts in between individual shots, and just trying to give that illusion of continuity that is kind of what we expect to some extent in a film. But during this era, they start to view editing as kind of an artistic choice, kind of like camera work or lighting or costumes. It was a way to not just create continuity, but also to create a mood or maybe to deliver a certain type of meaning. And that also kind of comes from the French New Wave. They were very influenced by a lot of those French filmmakers, and those guys would often use jump cuts, as I was describing last week, where we don't necessarily get one action that logically follows from the previous action. We might skip over some stuff, right? But the meaning is often still clear, and it might give us a more impressionistic, interesting, sort of unconventional way of seeing something. So again, using editing in different ways that would have differed from that classical Hollywood model. Moving the camera more, shooting on location more. We talked about on-location shoots a little bit last week with On the Waterfront. In the 50s, that movie was really lauded for doing so much on-location in New Jersey. But it was kind of novel because most Hollywood films didn't do that in the classical era. And like we said, the 50s were right at that point when the classical era is kind of coming to an end. So fast forward to the late 60s, 70s, that on-location style really becomes more and more common. So just a few notable films of the new Hollywood. These are famous movies that get talked about and written about a lot. The Graduate, 1967, directed by Mike Nichols, starring a young Dustin Hoffman, about sort of a melancholy college student who sort of lacks direction, sort of a coming-of-age story. They mentioned that genre in the chapter as one that the new Hollywood directors really liked. It had been around. It was an old genre, but they were sort of revitalizing it. Easy Rider, which came out in 1969, about, bikers, again, sort of counterculture guys. Bonnie and Clyde, that comes out in 1967, directed by Arthur Penn, starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway. Those might not be names a lot of you recognize, but, you should ask your parents or maybe your grandparents. If it's my parents, it would probably be most of your grandparents. Most of them will know who Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway are. That was a big movie, came out in 67, the same year as The Graduate. And then moving through Bullitt in 68 into the 70s, The Conversation, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, that came out in 74. Taxi Driver by Martin Scorsese, that comes out in 76. And then The Deer Hunter is another one at the end of the 70s. That was directed by Michael Cimino, starring a very young Christopher Walken, along with, who else is in that? Robert De Niro. Meryl Streep is in that one. But these are all movies that are very different thematically. They're all directed by different people. They have some of the same actors, like De Niro shows up in several of those. But different, plots, different subject matter, oftentimes very different stylistically. But all of the directors at the time, Scorsese, Coppola, Cimino, Arthur Penn, they were all pretty young. They were young. They were really just starting to kind of establish themselves as filmmakers in Hollywood. So Many of these films were concerned with youth culture. I wouldn't say Bullitt is as much, but they were all in some ways affected by the counterculture, sort of, the anti-war movement, hippies, a lot of the social sort of justice movements that were going on during that time, African American, civil rights movement, gay rights, Native American rights, Latino rights. All of that stuff kind of has an impact, even if it doesn't show up directly in the films. But if we look at the chapter, if they don't really talk about a lot of that stuff. They're talking about the blockbuster. They really talk about the new Hollywood era as beginning in the mid-70s with Jaws and then Star Wars in 1976, which they consider to be kind of the first two true blockbusters, proof, to quote the book here, proof that a single film could earn its studio hundreds of millions of dollars in profits. So just to put it in really crass, sort of simple terms, these movies were just incredibly profitable. They brought in tons of money, but also they're great examples of what I'm talking about. Again, Star Wars is kind of this mashup of old, like, B adventure movies, Japanese samurai movies, and a bunch of other stuff that George Lucas had kind of absorbed either as a kid or probably as a film student. Whereas Jaws, is sort of it's a horror film, right? It's not anything totally novel, but in terms of like its themes or its basic plot, but what is novel is some of the technological advancements that they had, again, involving camera size, their ability to move, but also the mechanical or like sort of fake shark that they were able to build, the realism of that. So it was technical innovation and sort of a new way of looking at things married with a devotion to old-timey familiar genres. And see, what studio executives realized is that's a really winning formula. Give audiences genres that are very familiar, that have been around for a long time, but do some cool new stuff technically, or have a really cool leading man or a really famous car chase sequence. And you're going to get really big viewership. You're going to make a lot of money. So that's kind of where a lot of scholars and critics actually stop the movement. Like, a lot of scholars will say in the mid-70s, this really creatively fertile sort of new Hollywood era that kicks off in the 60s really kind of comes to an end, because a lot of these innovative, really creative, sort of highly individual films are sort of put on the back burner in favor of blockbusters. So it's almost like a paradox. Jaws and Star Wars typify a lot of what was great about the new Hollywood era, but they become so popular, they become so profitable that they sort of become templates for the studios, who now want to just continue to make more movies like those. Let's make more blockbusters. Let's make franchises. Let's make sequels. Let's do promotional tie-ins so we can sell lunchboxes and action figures and comic books. And let's keep it going. So the book talks about that as really starting to become business as usual over the course of the 70s and 80s. And I think we can see that the studios still largely operate that way. They highly prize franchises that they can keep going for years, and they want to sort of churn out a lot of similar type films because that formula has been proven to work. Again, that's not new. I mean, that's a part of classic Hollywood too, but that's what's funny about this innovative era. It starts out kind of being totally different, but as the book points out, ultimately the new Hollywood looks a little bit like the old Hollywood, because the studios still have a lot of control, and ultimately they go in search of more and more blockbusters. So depending on who you ask, yeah, some scholars will say once that happens, right, once Jaws and Star Wars come along, The true artistic period of the new Hollywood is over, and it's replaced by a more commercially oriented blockbuster style of filmmaking. But others will point out that you still have a lot of interesting, innovative, creative films getting made throughout the 70s into the 80s, and really that never stops. There's always those films out there. You just have to sometimes look a little bit. So another thing to mention just quickly, because I think we can at least relate to it distantly, is the rise of the video cassette. Another thing that really sort of changes the film industry. And like most other things, at first the studios were kind of hostile, but eventually they realized this is another business that's going to potentially be good for them. So they mentioned in the chapter, we first had video cassettes in the 70s with the Betamax, when those were bigger. And then by the 80s, we had the VHS tape. Once the VHS sort of takes off and more people are getting VHS players, this becomes a very profitable revenue stream for the studios, because obviously people can now watch feature-length films from the comfort of their own homes. You can go to Blockbuster or some other video rental store and bring the movie home. So again, if you weren't able to see it in theaters, if you live in a small town or a rural area where you might not be able to really get to a movie theater very easily, you probably can get to a video rental store. So this really just expands viewership. More and more people now have access to the movies. And an interesting little trivia fact, by 1986, video cassette sales surpassed box office receipts. So for the first time ever, more people were watching movies at home on VHS than were in theaters. So that doesn't really hurt Hollywood, though. People are still going to theaters. They mentioned by 1990, there's as many movie theaters as there had been at any point in America, since the 20s, since the era of the movie palace, because you have all these new suburban multiplexes built often in shopping malls. So people are still going to the movies, but there's now another way to watch. Now, actually, there's two new ways, right? You can watch them on TV, but a lot of people prefer to watch it on tape because there's no commercials. You can fast forward, rewind, do whatever you want. And of course, that structure, that model largely stays the same, not only into the 90s, but into the early 2000s. It just shifts from VHS to DVD. And I'm of the age where VHSs feel a little old, like we had some. But when I was still pretty young, we started renting DVDs, and we got a DVD player in my family home. And that was the way we largely watched movies. We were in a small town. We had a theater, but a lot of movies didn't come there. So watching stuff on DVD was often our best bet. So I have distinct memories of that. Some of you might be old enough to share those. Even the early days of Netflix, they would still mail you the DVD of the film, and that's how you would watch it. I was doing that up through probably graduate school. That was how I consumed film for a long time, and that's how many people did. Now we've gone over to the streaming model, and the studios have a hand in that too. So the book, and again, this book is way too old to accommodate streaming, but they mention how the studios got a piece of cable television and also even like satellite broadcasting. And it's no different with the streaming era. A lot of this stuff is still getting produced by the same studios, distributed by the same studios, but there are some new players now. Netflix, Amazon, there are some new competitors in the field, but a lot of those old studios are still around and they're still making movies. It's just a lot of people are watching those movies on their phones now, which is very different, of course, than what it used to be. All right, so that's pretty much all the major changes I wanted to go through. They get into some of the minutia about how production became more independent during this period. You don't need to worry too much about that, but it is interesting just as a side note, and it's kind of another thing that's continued to this day. A lot of productions are largely independent, or they might be done by the filmmaker's own production company. Because as they mentioned, a lot of prominent directors, once they get successful and make some money, a lot of them will create their own production companies so they can have complete creative control over the films that they make. Something that the old-timey directors in classical Hollywood never could have hoped for, right? Working in that old studio model. But that is one of the major changes. The studios can't control everything. So some of the productions can be pretty independent, but then often the studio will come in and buy the film after it's produced, after it's made, and the studio will sell it. It will distribute it to whoever the exhibitor ends up being. And also in many other cases, the studio is still financing production, but they might just give more creative control, to the filmmaking team. So they remain very much in control. That's the main thing to remember. And a lot of the studios from the old days are still around in some form or another. Universal, 20th Century Fox. They mentioned Disney becoming a major player in the second half of the 20th century. Columbia Pictures gets bought by Sony. So they mentioned all that. And also, Hollywood is still exporting a lot of films internationally. All right. So let's spend the rest of lecture talking about Bullitt, one of my dad's favorite films. This is kind of a classic dad film. Steve McQueen, Jacqueline Bisset, directed by Peter Yates. This came out in 1968. I consider it a good example of the new Hollywood sort of era. Not everybody would classify it that way, but I think it has a lot in common with some of these other films that we've been mentioning. It's kind of hip and innovative in terms of its visuals and some of its technical achievements. It had one of the most successful and popular leading men of the time period as its star. It's hard to overstate how cool people thought Steve McQueen was in the 60s and 70s. So that was a big part of it. There's the iconic car chase sequence that we need to talk about. But also, as I mentioned before, shot entirely on location in San Francisco. So notable for that heightened sense of realism that I was talking about earlier. Now, I will mention Peter Yates is a little bit different from most of the other directors, and part of the reason this film might not get classified as a true product of the new Hollywood is the fact that Yates was an Englishman. I mean, he worked in Hollywood, but he's not an American by birth, and he was older. Like, he wasn't as young as a lot of the other new Hollywood directors, and he wasn't really of their generation and didn't really have a ton in common with them in terms of like background or like thematic concerns. But I would say stylistically, in terms of how some of his movies look, I do think he has he shares some similarities with some of these other American filmmakers. And this film was obviously, set in San Francisco, mostly featuring American actors. Bisset was English as well. But often viewed as one of the first really, truly modern action movies. You can classify it different ways. It's sort of a procedural, kind of a police procedural. I mean, you might just classify it as a cop movie. There's a lot of those with sort of a heroic detective main character. It is certainly that. It's a little bit of a mystery. It's a little bit of a thriller. But it's often viewed as sort of establishing a lot of action movie templates that are still followed today, as far as your protagonist, the car chase, the structure, the plotting, some of the characterization, and just the overall mood and sort of tone. But it's also very much a product of its time in terms of being sort of influenced by some European art films. And there's a little bit of ambiguity to it. Like, we have this heroic sort of kick-ass, leading man, but he seems a little ambivalent at times about the job. His girlfriend thinks it's making him callous. We have that sort of open-ended final shot where it's just sort of him, I think, looking at himself in the mirror after, after the climax of the film, all the action's kind of resolved. He looks a little haggard, maybe a little bit tortured. The job's obviously taking a toll on him. Again, heightened realism. Like, he's a cool guy, but the job doesn't always look super fun. They were trying to create a realistic portrait of this, this milieu, this occupation, and this character. So all of that, I think, kind of fits in with what we've been talking about. But I do want to spend a little bit of time on some of the technical achievements, just because I think they're cool and they're interesting and they're fun to observe, and it's hard to miss them when you're watching the film. I mean, you're going to notice, like I said, many of you have probably visited San Francisco or seen it on film before. You're going to notice that they are on location. You might recognize some landmarks. You can certainly recognize the geography, the hilly streets, the cable cars, all those things. A couple things that often get talked about with this film is sort of how Yates and his cinematographer shot it. Again, largely on location. They were using these lightweight cameras called the Aeroflex. And the book mentions that as we get into the late 60s and 70s, you have technological breakthroughs, advancements. Cameras get smaller. They get more lightweight. If you remember a few weeks ago when we were talking about Pancho Villa and those early Mexican newsreel footage of him and other militia leaders during the Mexican Revolution, and how they were trying to capture battle scenes, but it was difficult because cameras back then were so bulky and big, it was hard to move them, and they were so heavy. So the cameramen had to set up very far away from the action, which meant that they usually weren't getting great shots. But that's no longer a problem now. We can be a lot more mobile. We have lightweight equipment and we can move around. We also have advanced dolly technology. We mentioned this a little bit with The Wizard of Oz. We have these dollies, these ways to move the camera, to put them on tracks, so we can move them forward and back or side to side, or we can create tracking shots where the camera is following a character, following an actor as they move. So again, we can simulate movement, and that creates often a heightened sense of realism. Also, just the fact that they are shooting on location, and they're often not just in San Francisco, but in the hospital scenes, they're actually in a hospital. They're in a real hospital, and they're using real doctors and real nurses as extras. McQueen talks about this in a lot of interviews. It was something they made a point to do. Again, for that realistic effect. They wanted real doctors, real nurses, not actors playing doctors and nurses. And also, they wanted to be in a real hospital with all the real stuff. They felt like it wouldn't look realistic enough on a set or on a sound stage. You could simulate what a hospital looks like, but they wanted it to really feel real, so they said, let's just go and do it in a hospital. And luckily, they got lots of cooperation to be able to do it. Same with some of the police procedural details. They really wanted to get those details right. So when you see the cops processing evidence, it might be a little outdated. I think we have more advanced techniques now, but for the time period, it was highly accurate. That really was how police would have done it in 1968. So they really wanted to get all of that stuff done correctly. I don't think they used real policemen. I think they were all actors. But they got those details right. They got the hospital details right. And they also wanted to successfully capture the city, not just what it looks like, but kind of what it feels like to be in the city. And a lot of people thought they did that largely through the camera work and the editing. So a famous quote from Steve McQueen in some interview he did years after the movie came out. He said, "The thing we tried to achieve was not to do a theatrical film, but a film about reality." So we can dispute or argue, how well they do that, but that was the goal. Just before I forget, one little side note, just kind of an interesting little piece of trivia. McQueen, again, in his quest to be authentic, had studied for this role, kind of that method acting style that we talked about a little bit last week with Marlon Brando. But he went to San Francisco and kind of shadowed a real city police detective named Dave Toschi. And apparently he thought Toschi was pretty cool. He liked his style. And Toschi was the one who gave McQueen the idea to wear like that shoulder holster for his gun that we see throughout the movie. And at one point we see him putting it on, like before he goes to work. He got that idea from Dave Toschi, who was a real cop, and that's really how he wore his gun. McQueen thought it was cool. If you ever saw the film Zodiac, which is also set in San Francisco, Mark Ruffalo in that movie plays Dave Toschi. Toschi really was one of the investigators of the Zodiac killer, who mostly struck in and around San Francisco. So in that movie, somebody makes an offhanded reference to the fact that, oh yeah, McQueen got the idea for the holster from Toschi. So again, authenticity. McQueen wanted to really know how cops acted, how they dressed, how they approached the job. So he spent time with Toschi before production started. So I did want to spend a little bit of time on the car chase sequence just because it's very famous. And if you watch a lot of action movies, you've certainly seen a lot of car chases over the years. So this wasn't the first one. It existed as a concept. Other films had done it before, but a lot of historians and scholars will point to this particular car chase sequence and say it was the best ever done up until that point, and it might remain the best ever done. And it certainly influenced a lot of others that came after. So just a few facts to keep in mind. You might have noticed the driver's point of view shots that we see multiple times during the chase. That was thought of as kind of innovative and fun, kind of giving us that almost like first-hand, kind of first-person type of experience. Filming took over 3 weeks, and they ended up with about 9 minutes and 42 seconds of actual footage of pursuit. It took multiple takes. As you can imagine, this was very hard to pull off, so it was really just an impressive technical achievement overall. It took them so long, they had so many different shots, they had to splice it all together. So the editor of the film, Frank P. Keller, won the Oscar for Best Editing in 1968, not surprisingly, because a lot of this work fell on him. They had all this footage, and he had to assemble it in a sort of logical way that felt continuous, even though it obviously was not. So a lot of people like to do this kind of work on the internet. Of course, there have been a lot of studies of the sequence, and people have pointed out that there is a lot of discontinuity. Some things don't quite add up. I think the Charge, so we had the two cars, right? The Charger driven by the Hitman, and then the Mustang driven by Bullet, by Steve McQueen's character. So I think you see damage on the Mustang before it actually happens. And I think somebody points out that on the Charger, the car that's being chased, they lose 5 hubcaps over the course of the chase. So of course that's impossible. So yeah, that does happen. And also people have pointed out, and this was something they had to do as part of the technique, they've got multiple shots on the same street, or they got multiple shots in the same area where the same other cars might have been visible, and then they were splicing those shots together as if one happened, a while after the previous. So as a result, if when you're watching, you can notice that the same cars in the background show up multiple times, and we end up back on the same street. They're supposed to be going from street to street, but multiple shots would have been on the same street, just maybe a slightly different stretch of the street. So, of course, if you break it down into that kind of minutia, you can find a lot of little bits of discontinuity. You can notice the green Volkswagen Bug, Volkswagen Beetle, that shows up multiple times, the same car, at multiple points during the chase. But even with all of that being, there, it still looks great. And when you're watching it the first time, especially if you're not really stopping and slowing down or rewatching certain shots, it really does look continuous, and it really does look pretty smoothly done. So again, just really difficult from an editing standpoint to take all of that footage and create a sort of montage where, again, you get the illusion of going from street to street and covering ground and going in a sort of continuous progression from one place to the next. But of course, that's not how they filmed it. You know, the way it's meant to look is they start the chase in the city and then they kind of get out of the city. And it's all, you know, sort of chronological, but the way they had to film it was, of course, a lot different. They had to splice it all together during the editing process. So the driving itself is pretty impressive. McQueen was a race car driver, so just something he liked to do, but he was actually pretty good. I mean, he actually won money. He ran in like professional races. So he did some of the driving himself, but of course he was a very valuable asset, so you couldn't put him in too much danger. He mostly drove during the close-up scenes. And then for a lot of the other shots, they would use a stunt double. They would also use a motorcycle racer named Bud Elkins. And he's the guy that's actually riding the motorcycle, and he has to like sort of jump off when the skidding truck is coming close to him. So he kind of does that little, I don't know, I have it down here in my notes. There's a particular term for it, a low-sider crash stunt. But he kind of slides, you know, along the street to avoid the truck. So that's Bud Elkins. He was actually a motorcycle racer, but also a stuntman. So he did some of the driving. McQueen's usual stunt double also did some of it. And then the stunt coordinator, this guy named Kerry Lofton, also did some of it. So just a few facts, and one way to tell who's actually in the car at any given time, you can tell by the rear view mirror in the Mustang. So it goes up or down depending on who's driving. When the mirror is up and McQueen is visible, that's when he's driving. But when the mirror is down and you can't see the driver, that's when one of the stunt guys was driving. So, again, for a lot of the close-ups, McQueen really would be behind the wheel. But for some of the really dangerous, fast driving that would often be filmed further away, for the long shot, that would often be the stunt guys. But they had to practice. You know, McQueen, there's actually a pretty good documentary that I might link you to. It's just like 10, 15 minutes, so it's a little short piece. But McQueen talks about how he and Elkins and the other stunt guys, and also Bill Hickman, who's driving the Charger and plays one of the hitmen. Hickman was a professional race car driver and stuntman. So all of these guys got together and practiced the driving before they were ready to shoot it. They had to practice, get synchronized, and McQueen mentions that even some of the people that you see, like some of the bystanders and like some of the non-drivers that you see, were actually stuntmen. Because even if they weren't driving a car, they were more experienced at like jumping out of the way and rolling and like doing things to avoid getting hurt in a way that a regular person wouldn't be able to do. So they all had to rehearse. It helped that they were all, you know, professional drivers, including McQueen. So they all had a pretty high skill level. But it took a lot of work. It took a long time to film, but it's still pretty iconic and people still talk about it to this day. And like I said, Keller won an Oscar for his editing, and he's often given a lot of credit for sort of making San Francisco feel like a character, feel like a real character in the story. People also commented on the music. This was an original score composed just for the film by Lalo Schifrin, and it's sort of contemporary American jazz that might not be everybody's favorite genre, but it was pretty popular back then, and it was a popular score, popular soundtrack, all original music made by Schifrin and other prominent American jazz musicians of that time. So, and yeah, just a quick word on McQueen. I don't know how familiar you guys are with him. He died in 1980. Died of, I think, a rare form of cancer. I think it was the one caused by asbestos. I can never pronounce it. Meslo. You always see the commercials about it. But anyway, he died very suddenly at the age of 50. But in the late 60s through the 70s, it didn't get much cooler than Steve McQueen. He was in a lot of blockbusters. He was in a lot of big movies. This is one of his more popular, but he was in others, The Magnificent Seven and I can't remember the disaster movie that he was in. But you can look him up. He's got a pretty interesting filmography. His last one that he did before getting sick was The Hunter in 1980. Kind of got his start doing some TV stuff, doing bit roles in the 50s, got bigger in the 60s, and became a huge movie star by the end of that decade. People just thought he was very charismatic, obviously, good looking, sort of had an air about him that made people think that he was a little bit of a nonconformist, even in a role like this when he's playing a cop. He's kind of doing things his own way. He kind of rebels against the corrupt systems around him. He has his own moral code. And there is that suggestion at the end that maybe he's ready to leave this violent way of life behind. So I want you to think a little bit about his performance. I think, again, if you watch modern day action stars in movies like this where they play tough cops trying to bring down ferocious killers, a lot of McQueen's mannerisms, the way he delivers dialogue, maybe not so much the clothes, maybe not even so much the Mustang, but just his manner, his style, his tone, the way he carries himself. I think it's been very influential to a lot of other actors in more contemporary times. Even if it's not a direct influence, they're sort of emulating some of what we see in this movie. So hopefully you guys have some ideas. You can talk about this film next week. But for now, for the rest of this week, once you've seen the movie and taken a few notes, really turn your attention to the paper. And if you have questions about my feedback or anything else, get in touch and we can talk. All right, I'll see you next time.